My daughter took out a $750,000 loan in my name to buy a house, but then I found out who really lives there. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day of unremarkable gray skies and a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very bones of my old house. I remember the slick feel of the high-quality paper, the intimidatingly official crest of a bank I'd never dealt with. It felt cold, alien. My husband, David, had handled all our finances with meticulous care, and since his passing 5 years ago, I'd continued his legacy of prudence. I paid my bills on time, lived well within my means, and harbored a deep-seated distrust of debt. The single sheet of paper inside the envelope seemed to mock all of it. It was a notice of delinquency. A mortgage payment, it stated in severe, unforgiving print, was 30 days overdue. The amount was staggering, a figure that belonged to the world of corporate finance, not the quiet life of a 58-year-old widow in suburban Ohio. $750,000. The address listed for the property was a sprawling new construction in a gated community on the other side of the state, a place I'd only seen in glossy real estate magazines. My name, Sarah Connolly, was printed clearly as the sole borrower. For a moment, the world dissolved into a silent, humming void. It was a mistake, a clerical error of monumental proportions. That was the only possible explanation. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dialed the bank's number, my voice a reedy whisper when the automated system finally connected me to a human being. The woman on the other end was patient, professional, and utterly unhelpful. She confirmed the details. The loan was real. The Social Security number was mine. The signature on the digital application, she assured me, had passed all their verification checks. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my disbelief. Identity theft. The words screamed in my mind. I had been violated, my meticulously guarded life breached by some faceless criminal. I thanked the woman, my throat tight with unshed tears, and hung up. My first instinct was to call the police, to report the crime. But then a sliver of ice, a dreadful, unthinkable suspicion, slid into my heart. There was only one person who had access to all my documents, who knew my mother's maiden name, the name of my first pet, all the silly, intimate details that served as security questions in this digital age. My daughter, Emily. I called her. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. My palm was slick with sweat. She finally answered, her voice bright and cheerful, the sound that had been the anchor of my life since David died. I asked her about the house, my voice strained. There was a pause, a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation that spoke volumes. She feigned ignorance at first, a flurry of confused questions. But I pressed, the cold dread in my gut overriding the maternal instinct to protect, to believe the best. Finally, the truth came out, not in a torrent of remorse, but in a defensive, almost petulant rush of words. It wasn't stealing, she explained, her voice hardening. It was borrowing. She and her husband, Mark, had found their dream house, the perfect place to raise their future children. But their credit wasn't good enough, their down payment too small. They knew I'd never agree to co-sign for such a huge amount, that I would call it reckless. So, they had taken matters into their own hands. They had used my good name, as she put it, to secure their future. Mark, a tech-savvy web designer, had handled the digital application. It was foolproof. She told me not to worry, that they would make all the payments. It was just a formality, a temporary arrangement until they could refinance in their own names. She said it as if she were explaining a simple errand, as if the forgery of my signature, the appropriation of my financial identity for $750,000 was a minor inconvenience I was being unreasonable about. I listened, the phone feeling heavier than a block of lead in my hand. The living room, filled with memories of David and a younger, sweeter Emily, seemed to tilt on its axis. Every photograph on the mantelpiece, every piece of furniture we had chosen together, felt like a prop in a life that was no longer mine. When the call ended, I sank into David's old armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin. The shock was a physical blow, leaving me breathless and hollow. It wasn't just the money. It was the calculated nature of the deception. The months of planning it must have taken. The casual way they had discussed my life, my finances, my very identity as a resource to be exploited. I thought of all the sacrifices I'd made for her. The college tuition that had drained my savings, the down payment for her first car, the countless times I'd transferred money to her account to cover an unexpected bill or a last-minute trip. I had given her everything, believing I was building a foundation for her happiness. Instead, I had built the tools for my own destruction. The chilling realization settled over me. My love had been seen not as a gift, but as a liability to be circumvented. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own heart breaking. Impotence washed over me, a suffocating wave of self-blame. How could I have been so blind, so foolishly, devastatingly naive? Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stark black and white numbers on the bank letter, $750,000. It was a sum that represented more than money. It was the physical manifestation of David's life's work, the safety net he had painstakingly woven for my future. And my own daughter had torn it to shreds without a second thought. The hours before dawn were the longest of my life. I paced the silent house, the ghost of my own naivety mocking me from every corner. The grief was a raw, open wound, but underneath it, something else was beginning to stir. A cold, hard ember of anger. Around 3 a.m., fueled by a bitter mix of insomnia and adrenaline, I went to my study. The room was my sanctuary, a place of order and calm. But now, it felt like a crime scene. I sat at David's old mahogany desk and switched on the lamp, the warm pool of light illuminating the chaos of my thoughts. If they could lie about a loan this massive, what else had they been lying about? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer. I pulled out my laptop and began to dig. For years, I had maintained a joint savings account with Emily, a holdover from her college days that I'd kept open for emergencies. I rarely checked the detailed statements, trusting her completely. I'd notice $100 missing here, $200 there. She always had a plausible explanation. A textbook she needed, a car repair, a dentist appointment. I had accepted it all without question, eager to be the supportive mother she needed. Now I opened the transaction history for the past 5 years. My blood ran cold. I started a spreadsheet, just as David would have done. I meticulously logged every withdrawal, every transfer that wasn't a scheduled payment or one of my own transactions. The small emergencies were not small at all. They were a steady, relentless bleed. $300 for a weekend getaway with friends. $500 for a new laptop for Mark's freelance work. $800 for vet bills for a pet I now realized they'd never owned. There were dozens of cash withdrawals from ATMs near high-end shopping malls, charges from boutique clothing stores, and payments to restaurants I knew I could never afford. It was a systematic plundering, hidden in plain sight, masked by my own willful blindness and their sweet-voiced lies. Each entry on the spreadsheet was a small cut, a tiny betrayal that, taken together, amounted to a mortal wound. I worked through the night, the clatter of the keyboard the only sound in the house. I cross-referenced credit card statements, old checkbook registers, anything I could find. I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was an auditor, a forensic accountant of my own life. By the time the first pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, the spreadsheet was complete. The final number at the bottom of the column stared back at me, a testament to my own folly. Beyond the fraudulent $750,000 mortgage, I had loaned, gifted, and had simply taken from me over $85,000 in the last 5 years. $85,000. Money that was meant for my retirement, for a new roof. For the trip to Italy, I'd always dreamed of taking in David's memory. All of it gone, siphoned away to fund a lifestyle of comfort and leisure for two able-bodied adults who saw me as nothing more than a line of credit. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the room, and as I stared at that number, something inside me shifted. The emotional dam broke. But it wasn't a flood of tears that came. It was a wave of ice. The pain was still there, a dull, heavy ache in my chest, but it was now overlaid with a crystalline, diamond-hard clarity. The image of the doting, endlessly forgiving mother I had tried so hard to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. In her place stood a woman I barely recognized, a woman who had been played for a fool and was not going to let it happen again. My first call was not to Emily, but to my bank. My voice was calm, firm, devoid of the hysteria I had felt just 12 hours earlier. I instructed the representative to freeze the joint account immediately and to put a fraud alert on all my personal accounts. I then called a locksmith and arranged for all the locks on my house to be changed that afternoon. I had given Emily a key years ago, just in case. The thought of her being able to walk into my home, my sanctuary, now felt like a profound violation. My final action was to open a new browser tab and type, "Financial Fraud Attorney." The time for tears was over. The time for self-pity was over. My daughter and her husband had started a war, believing they were fighting a weak, emotionally compromised old woman. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. For the first time, I was choosing myself. My survival depended on it. The locksmith had just finished installing a heavy, reassuringly solid deadbolt on my front door when their car pulled into the driveway. Mark's sleek black sedan, a car I now suspected I had helped pay for, crunched on the gravel with an arrogant finality. They hadn't called. They hadn't texted. They had simply appeared, assuming, as always, that my home was an extension of their own, my time theirs to command. I watched them from the window, my heart a cold, tight knot in my chest. Emily marched toward the door with a look of righteous indignation, Mark a half-step behind her, his expression a practiced mask of concern. I heard the scrape of her old key in the new lock, followed by a frustrated jiggle and then a loud, impatient knock. I took a deep, steadying breath and opened the door, leaving the security chain in place. They stood on my porch, framed by the late afternoon light, looking like a pair of wronged suburbanites. Emily's face was flushed with anger. She started talking before I could say a word, her voice high and accusatory. She had received an alert from the bank that their joint account was frozen. She wanted to know what was going on, why I would do such a thing without talking to them first. She spoke as if she were the victim, as if my act of self-preservation was a personal attack on her. I told them calmly that we needed to discuss the $750,000 loan. Mark stepped forward, placing a placating hand on Emily's arm. He adopted the tone of a reasonable man dealing with an emotional woman. He said he understood I was upset, but that freezing the account was a dramatic overreaction. They had a plan, he assured me, a solid plan to handle the mortgage. He said they came over to explain it all, to put my mind at ease. I didn't move from the doorway. I told them that their explanation could wait. First, they needed to explain the $85,000 they had siphoned from my accounts over the past 5 years. The color drained from Emily's face. Mark's mask of concern faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, then annoyance. It was clear they hadn't expected me to do the math. They had relied on my inattention, my trust, my unwillingness to see the ugly truth. The conversation devolved quickly. The pretense of concern evaporated, replaced by raw, unvarnished manipulation. Emily accused me of being selfish, of trying to sabotage their happiness just as they were starting their lives. She brought up all the things she had done for me after David's death. The grocery runs, the phone calls, the company. Each act of love was reframed as a transaction, a service for which she was now owed a lifetime of financial support. Then Mark took a more insidious tack. He spoke to me in a slow, deliberate voice, as if I were a child. He mentioned my age. He said that maybe I was getting confused, that my memory wasn't what it used to be. He suggested that I might have forgotten a conversation where I'd agreed to help them with the house. He said they were worried about me, that my recent actions, changing the locks, freezing accounts, were erratic. It was a veiled threat, a chilling attempt to lay the groundwork for a narrative of my mental decline. They weren't just trying to excuse their actions, they were trying to gaslight me into believing I was the one who was unwell. The pressure was immense. Every word was designed to trigger my maternal guilt, to exploit my deepest fears of aging and loneliness. They were a well-oiled machine, seamlessly shifting from emotional blackmail to subtle threats. The final blow came when I mentioned calling the police. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of rage. She hissed that if I went to the authorities, I would be sending my own daughter to prison. I would be destroying the family. Was that what I wanted? To be left completely alone in this big, empty house, knowing I had ruined my only child's life over some money? She spat the words out as if the fortune they had stolen was nothing more than pocket change. The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were demanding my silence, my complicity. They stood on my porch, having been caught in an act of profound betrayal, and had the audacity to position themselves as the injured party. The love I had for the daughter I thought I knew warred with the cold fury I felt toward the stranger standing in front of me. They weren't just thieves. They were emotional terrorists, and they had just declared all-out war on my sanity. I stood there, the security chain the only thing separating my world from theirs, and knew that this was only the beginning. For a long moment, I just stared at them through the narrow gap in the doorway. I saw the calculated tears on my daughter's face and the cold, appraising look in her husband's eyes. They were waiting for me to crumble. They expected me to unlatch the chain, let them in, and allow them to soothe and bully me back into submission. It was a dance they had perfected over years, and I had always been a willing, if unwitting, partner. But the music had stopped. The woman who had always placated, always yielded, was gone. A strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a battlefield after the first deafening volley of cannon fire, when the smoke clears and the true landscape of the conflict is revealed. I was no longer looking at my child and her husband. I was looking at two adversaries. "There is nothing to discuss," I said. My voice was low and steady, a tone I hadn't used in years. It held no anger, no hysteria. It held only the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. You entered my home. Not physically, but you entered my life, without permission. You took what was not yours, and now you stand on my porch and insult my intelligence. Emily's tears stopped abruptly, her expression hardening into disbelief. This was not part of the script. "Mom, don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "We are trying to talk to you, to work this out." "There is no working this out," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "You have committed a serious crime. The house you bought with my name is not your dream. It is evidence. The $85,000 you stole from me is not help. It is theft. These are not matters for a family discussion. They are matters for the law." Mark's jaw tightened. The condescending demeanor vanished, replaced by a flash of pure menace. "You need to be very careful, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He used my first name, a deliberate act of disrespect, of stripping me of my maternal authority. "You're overwrought. You're not thinking clearly. You're going to make a decision you'll regret for the rest of your life." "The only regret I have," I said, my hand tightening on the door, "is that it took me this long to see you for who you really are. Now, I am asking you to leave my property. If you do not, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." The shock on their faces was absolute. It was as if their most reliable tool, my unconditional love and tolerance for their behavior, had suddenly been yanked from their grasp. They were speechless, their threats and manipulations rendered useless against this wall of cold resolve. Emily made one last, desperate attempt, her voice now a pleading whine. "Mom, please." Think about what you're doing. To me, to your future grandchildren. The mention of grandchildren, the ones they had used as emotional justification for their grand theft, was the final insult. You will not use the idea of children I may never have to blackmail me, I said, my voice as sharp as broken glass. You lost that right. Now leave. Without waiting for another word, I closed the door. The solid thud of the new deadbolt sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I leaned against the door, my legs trembling, my body flooded with a terrifying, exhilarating surge of adrenaline. I fully expected them to start pounding on the door, to shout, to create a scene. But there was only silence. I crept to the living room window and peered through the blinds. They were standing by their car, heads close together, engaged in a furious, whispered argument. Then they got in, and the black sedan sped away, spitting gravel from its tires. They were gone. The immediate threat had passed. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely silence of a widow. It was the charged silence of a fortress. I had held the line. I had faced them down and won the first skirmish. A wave of dizziness washed over me, a mixture of fear, grief, and a fierce, unfamiliar pride. The path ahead was terrifying. They would not give up easily. But as I walked through my quiet, secure house, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not back down. I had spent my life building a home. Now I would fight to the death to defend it. The adrenaline from the confrontation kept me going for hours, but by evening, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion set in. The reality of my situation was a crushing weight. I was a 58-year-old woman about to enter a legal battle against my own daughter. A battle that would be expensive, emotionally draining, and public. The thought of my family's private shame being laid bare in a courtroom was mortifying. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe I should just let it go, find a way to absorb the cost, and try to salvage some semblance of a relationship. Then I looked at the photograph of David on my nightstand. His smile was kind, but his eyes were clear and saw through any pretense. He had worked his entire life, sacrificing so much to ensure I would be safe and secure after he was gone. Letting Emily and Mark get away with this would be a betrayal of him, of everything he stood for. It would be a betrayal of myself. The doubt vanished, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honor. It was about justice. The next morning, I delved into the research I had started. I spent hours online, reading about financial fraud, identity theft, and elder exploitation. The more I read, the more I understood the gravity of what Emily and Mark had done. This wasn't a simple family dispute. It was a felony. The articles I found were filled with stories of people whose lives had been ruined by financial abuse from those they trusted most. But they were also filled with stories of people who had fought back. These stories gave me a roadmap and a sliver of hope. My search for an attorney was methodical. I didn't want a family lawyer who would push for reconciliation. I needed a fighter, a specialist. I found a firm in the city that focused exclusively on financial crimes and civil litigation. One name stood out: Helen Davis. Her biography was formidable. A former prosecutor, she had a reputation for being relentless, brilliant, and fiercely protective of her clients. She sounded expensive. She sounded intimidating. She sounded perfect. Making the appointment was the hardest phone call of my life. Admitting the details to a stranger, saying the words, "My daughter stole my identity" out loud, was a profound humiliation. But the paralegal who answered was professional and discreet, and she scheduled a consultation for the following afternoon. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I organized all my documents into a thick binder. The fraudulent mortgage papers, the bank statements with the suspicious withdrawals highlighted, the spreadsheet I had created detailing the $85,000 in losses, even a timeline of Emily's increasingly urgent requests for money. I also found a string of old text messages. Read individually, they seemed innocuous. Mom, can you help me out? Just till payday. So stressed, the car broke down again. Mark's biggest client is late paying. We're in a real bind. But read together, they formed a damning pattern of manufactured crises and relentless financial pressure. The next day, I drove into the city. Helen Davis's office was in a tall glass building that seemed to scrape the sky. It was a world away from my quiet suburban life. Helen herself was exactly as I had imagined. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of no-nonsense competence. She didn't offer platitudes or expressions of sympathy. She listened, her gaze fixed on me as I laid out the whole sordid story. I felt my voice crack a few times, but I pushed through, determined to present the facts without breaking down. When I finished, I pushed the binder across her polished desk. She spent the next 30 minutes silently reviewing the documents, her expression unreadable. The silence was unnerving. I started to worry that my case wasn't strong enough, that I had missed something crucial. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine. "Mrs. Connolly," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "this is not a family squabble. This is grand larceny, identity theft, and bank fraud. What your daughter and son-in-law have done is not just morally reprehensible, it is highly illegal." A wave of relief so profound it almost made me weep washed over me. She believed me. She wasn't judging me for being a fool. She was seeing the crime for what it was. "Their attempt to gaslight you," she continued, tapping a finger on my notes about the confrontation, "suggesting you're forgetful or confused, is a classic tactic used by abusers. It's designed to isolate you and make you doubt your own reality. It's also something that judges take a very dim view of." She laid out a plan of action. First, we would file a police report to create an official record of the crimes. Second, we would contact the bank's fraud department with a formal notarized affidavit. Third, we would place a permanent freeze on my credit with all 3 major credit bureaus to prevent any further damage. And fourth, we would file a civil lawsuit against Emily and Mark for the recovery of the stolen funds and damages. "This will be a difficult process," she warned me. "They will fight back. They will say terrible things about you. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at her, the binder of evidence lying between us like a shield. "Ms. Davis," I said, my voice filled with a conviction I didn't know I possessed, "they have already done their worst. I am prepared for anything." Leaving her office, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer a victim. I was a plaintiff. The fight had begun. The days following my meeting with Helen were a whirlwind of official actions. Filing the police report was a surreal experience. I sat in a small, sterile room at the local precinct, recounting the intimate betrayal to a detective whose weary eyes had clearly seen it all before. He was surprisingly kind, explaining that this kind of family fraud was tragically common. Handing him the copies of my evidence felt like crossing a point of no return. The gears of the justice system were now turning, slowly but irrevocably. As Helen had predicted, the official notifications sent shockwaves through Emily and Mark's carefully constructed world. The first sign of their panic came not as a direct confrontation, but as a phone call a week later. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered out of caution. It was Emily. Her tone was completely different from the angry, accusatory one she had used on my porch. This was the old Emily, the one whose voice was soft, sweet, and laced with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. She started by sobbing. She said she had received a letter from my lawyer. She couldn't believe I had actually gone to the police. She didn't understand how I could do this to my own daughter. The tears were theatrical, a performance I could now see with painful clarity. I remained silent, letting her play out the first act. Then her tone shifted to one of desperate contrition. She said they had made a terrible mistake. They were scared, they were stupid, and they had acted impulsively. Mark was a wreck, she claimed, terrified of losing everything. She said they would do anything, absolutely anything, to make it right. They would sell the house, she promised, even if it was at a loss. They would set up a payment plan to pay back every single penny of the $85,000, even if it took them the rest of their lives. It was a tempting offer. The thought of avoiding a protracted legal battle, of sidestepping the public humiliation of a trial, was incredibly appealing. For a moment, the part of me that was still a mother, the part that instinctively wanted to heal and forgive, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they had finally understood the magnitude of what they had done. Then came the final act of her performance, the true purpose of the call. "Let's just handle this ourselves, Mom," she pleaded, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Please, just call off the lawyers and the police. We can fix this. Let me cook you dinner on Sunday, just the three of us. We can sit down at the table, like we used to, and figure it all out as a family." The invitation hung in the air, a perfectly crafted trap, a home-cooked meal, a return to how things used to be. It was an appeal to nostalgia, an attempt to lure me back into the familiar dynamic where I was the peacemaker, the provider of comfort and forgiveness. They didn't want a courtroom where their lies would be dissected under oath. They wanted my kitchen table, where they could deploy their full arsenal of emotional manipulation, where my love and guilt were their greatest allies. They wanted to pull me away from Helen, from the police, from the objective reality of the law, and back into the fog of family. I thought of Helen's warning. "They will try to get you alone. They will promise you the world. Do not engage. Do not agree to any meetings without me present." The flicker of hope died, extinguished by a cold, hard dose of reality. They weren't sorry for the crime. They were sorry they got caught. This wasn't an act of repentance. It was an act of damage control. "Emily," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of the warmth she was trying so desperately to ignite. "There is no us to figure it all out. You made a series of choices. Now you have to face the consequences of those choices." The sobbing on the other end of the line stopped instantly. A cold silence took its place. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It means I will not be calling off my lawyer," I stated calmly. "I will not be withdrawing the police report. And I will not be having dinner with you on Sunday. Any future communication from you or Mark must go through Helen Davis. Do you understand?" I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she processed her failure. The sweet, remorseful daughter vanished, replaced once again by the cold, calculating stranger. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice filled with a venom that chilled me to the bone. "You have no idea what you've just done." "No, Emily," I replied, a profound sadness washing over me as I spoke the final truth. "I have no idea what you've done, and I don't think you do either." I ended the call. I didn't slam the phone down in anger. I simply disconnected, severing the line of communication. The temptation had been presented, a golden apple of false peace, and I had rejected it. There was no going back. The bridges were not just burned, they had been vaporized. In the weeks that followed, a profound sense of isolation began to set in. The initial empowerment I felt after hiring Helen and rejecting Emily's manipulative plea began to fade, replaced by the grim, day-to-day reality of my new life. The house felt cavernous and empty. My phone, once filled with daily texts and calls from Emily, was now silent. Friends who were closer to Emily than to me had suddenly become distant, and I could feel the tendrils of the narrative Emily and Mark were likely weaving. That of a confused, vindictive mother lashing out at her loving children. I was an island, and the tide of loneliness was rising. One afternoon, while forcing myself to run errands, I ran into an old friend, Carol, in the supermarket. We had been close when our children were young, but had drifted apart over the years. She took one look at my face, at the stress etched into the lines around my eyes, and her expression softened with genuine concern. Instead of the usual pleasantries, she simply asked, "Sarah, are you okay?" "You don't look well." Something in her simple, direct kindness broke through my carefully constructed walls. We ended up in a nearby coffee shop, and for the first time, I told someone the entire story. I laid it all out: the loan, the stolen money, the confrontation, the lawyer. I expected shock, maybe even pity. What I got was something far more valuable: understanding. Carol listened without interruption, and when I was done, she reached across the table and took my hand. She told me that her own sister had gone through something similar with her son a few years back. It was a story of entitlement, manipulation, and the painful process of setting boundaries. "You feel like you're the only one," Carol said softly, "but you're not. This poison, it's everywhere." A few days later, she called me. She invited me to a small, informal get-together at her house. She described it as just a few friends having coffee. When I arrived, I found myself in a room with 5 other women, all around my age. Carol introduced us, and as the afternoon unfolded, I realized this was no ordinary coffee clatch. It was an unofficial, unspoken support group. One by one, as we sat in Carol's warm, inviting living room, the women shared their stories. One woman, Maria, spoke of how she had to get a restraining order against her own brother after he drained their elderly mother's bank accounts. Another, Linda, recounted her divorce from a man who had secretly taken out a second mortgage on their home to fund his gambling addiction. Each story was different in its details, but achingly similar in its themes of betrayal, manipulation, and the gut-wrenching pain of being financially abused by a loved one. For the first time in months, I didn't feel shame. I felt a profound sense of kinship. These women understood the unique agony of my situation. They knew the self-doubt, the misplaced guilt, the social isolation. They didn't offer easy advice or empty platitudes. They offered validation. They nodded in recognition when I described Mark's gaslighting. They shared my rage when I told them about the stolen $85,000. In that room, surrounded by their quiet strength and shared experience, I was not a victim or a fool. I was a survivor. This newfound community became my lifeline. We met every week, sharing legal updates, small victories, and moments of despair. They gave me the strength to endure the silence from the rest of the world. But I knew I needed something more. I needed to reconnect with the person I was before all this, the woman David had loved. One clear, cold Saturday morning, I drove out to the cemetery where he was buried. I hadn't been in months, ashamed of the chaos my life had become, feeling I had failed to protect the legacy he had left me. I knelt on the damp grass beside his headstone, tracing the cold, carved letters of his name. I spoke to him, the words coming out in a raw, choked whisper. I told him everything. I confessed my blindness, my foolish trust. I apologized for letting our daughter, the child he had adored, dishonor his memory and squander the security he had worked so hard to build. "I was so lonely after you left, David," I whispered, tears finally streaming down my face. "I think I tried to buy her love, to keep her close. I thought that by giving her everything, I was being a good mother. But I wasn't. I was enabling her. I'm so sorry I let this happen." I cried for a long time, a deep, cleansing grief for my husband, for the daughter I had lost, and for the woman I had allowed myself to become. As the tears subsided, a sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't asking for a sign or for forgiveness from a ghost. I was forgiving myself. I was releasing the burden of guilt. I stood up, my knees stiff from the cold ground. I promised David and myself that I would see this through. I would fight not out of anger or revenge, but out of a duty to honor his life and to reclaim my own. The fight ahead was still daunting, but I was no longer fighting it alone. I had my army of women, and I had a renewed connection to the values David and I had shared. I was spiritually cleansed and ready for the next battle. The first formal counterattack arrived via courier, a thick, intimidating envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from the lawyer Emily and Mark had hired. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression and revisionist history. The letter stated that my claims were baseless and defamatory. It alleged that I had, in fact, verbally agreed to help them secure the loan for the house, promising to act as a guarantor. They claimed my subsequent actions were born not of betrayal, but of a sudden and inexplicable change of heart, possibly linked to age-related cognitive issues. There it was again, the insidious whisper of my supposed mental decline, now codified in legal language. They were formally building a case not just that I was wrong, but that I was unreliable, confused, and incompetent. The letter went on to threaten a countersuit for slander and emotional distress if I did not immediately withdraw my police report and civil complaint. They were not just defending, they were actively trying to paint me as the aggressor, a malicious and unstable mother attempting to extort her own children. My hands shook as I read it, but this time, it was with rage, not fear. I immediately scanned the documents and emailed them to Helen. Her reply was swift and succinct. Standard intimidation tactics. Ignore the threats. We proceed as planned. Her confidence was a balm to my frayed nerves. A few days later, the psychological warfare escalated. A small, unmarked package appeared on my doorstep. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a silver picture frame holding a photograph of a 5-year-old Emily, grinning gap-toothed at the camera, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck. It was a picture from our trip to the Grand Canyon, one of my most cherished memories. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was clear. Remember this? Remember the mother you used to be? The one who loved me unconditionally? This is who you are destroying. I stared at the photo, at the image of the innocent child I had loved more than life itself. The pain was a physical blow, a punch to the gut. They were mining my memories, turning my love into a weapon to be used against me. For a moment, my resolve wavered. But then I looked closer at the happy, smiling woman in the photograph. Me. That woman deserved better. She deserved to have her love reciprocated, not exploited. She deserved to grow old with dignity, not to be bankrupted and gaslighted by the very child she was holding. With a deep breath, I removed the photo from the frame, slid it into a drawer, and put the empty frame in the recycling bin. I would not allow them to desecrate my past. The true test of my resistance, however, came from an unexpected source. While sorting through some of David's old financial files for Helen, I stumbled upon a box I hadn't opened in years. It contained the paperwork from a small portfolio of stocks he had inherited from his father. David had always managed it himself, and after his death, I had simply instructed his broker to reinvest the dividends, paying little attention to it. I had assumed it was a modest sum, a small rainy day fund. Curious, I pulled out the most recent statement. The number at the bottom made me gasp. Thanks to a few shrewd investments David had made in tech companies decades ago, the modest portfolio was now worth a significant amount of money. It wasn't life-changing, but it was more than enough to cover all my legal fees, and then some. It was a safety net I never knew I had. My first thought was relief. My second was a cold, hard realization. If I knew about this, it was possible, even likely, that Emily knew about it too. David had sometimes spoken of the legacy portfolio in her presence. Was this their endgame? Had they assumed that even if I discovered the fraud, I would eventually dip into this fund to cover the loss? To make the problem go away quietly to avoid a family scandal? The thought was sickening. It suggested an even deeper level of premeditated exploitation. I called Helen immediately and told her about the discovery. Her reaction was sharp. Do not mention this to anyone, Sarah. Not your friends, no one. This is our ace in the hole. They are operating under the assumption that you are financially vulnerable. They believe they can drain you with legal fees until you give up. Let them continue to believe that. Her advice solidified my resolve. This was a war of attrition, and I had just discovered a secret supply line. I resisted the urge to feel secure. Instead, I felt a renewed sense of vigilance. I continued to live frugally, to act as if every dollar mattered, because it did, not just financially, but strategically. My greatest weapon was their underestimation of me. They saw a grieving widow with limited resources. They had no idea they were fighting a woman who was not only emotionally resilient, but also, thanks to her husband's foresight, financially prepared to go the distance. I would let them drain their own resources, exposing their greed and desperation with every legal maneuver they made. My resistance was no longer just about saying no, it was about strategic silence and patient endurance. The months leading up to the court date were a grueling marathon of depositions, motions, and legal maneuvering. Emily and Mark's lawyer was aggressive, filing endless requests for documents, trying to bury us in paperwork and drive up my legal costs. He deposed me for 2 full days, his questions circling relentlessly around my mental state, my relationship with David, and my spending habits. He tried to twist my grief into depression, my prudence into paranoia. I stuck to the facts, my voice calm and steady, Helen by my side, objecting and redirecting with the precision of a surgeon. The day of the trial finally arrived. I walked into the courtroom feeling a strange mixture of terror and resolve. Emily and Mark were already there, seated beside their lawyer. They looked polished and confident. Emily was dressed in a conservative navy blue dress, looking every bit the wrong daughter. Mark wore a tailored suit, his expression somber and concerned. They refused to look at me. Their lawyer's opening statement painted a vivid picture of a loving, supportive couple trying to manage the increasingly erratic behavior of an aging parent. He spoke of my isolation, my sudden hostility, and my unfounded financial accusations, portraying their actions as a clumsy but well-intentioned attempt to secure a family home they believed I had approved. They presented their case first. Mark took the stand, testifying under oath that I had verbally agreed to the loan during a phone call he claimed I no longer remembered. He spoke of my forgetfulness, of instances where I had misplaced keys or forgotten appointments, weaving a tapestry of minor memory lapses into a portrait of cognitive decline. Then Emily testified. Her performance was breathtaking. She wept as she described her deep love for me and her heartbreak at my betrayal. She told the court she was terrified for my well-being, suggesting I was being manipulated by my new friends and my predatory lawyer. It was a compelling narrative, and I could see a flicker of sympathy in the judge's eyes. When it was Helen's turn to cross-examine, the tide began to turn. She was methodical, relentless. She presented Mark with phone records that showed no call had taken place on the day he claimed I had given my verbal consent. She dismantled his claims of my confusion by providing records from my doctor confirming my excellent health and cognitive function. With Emily on the stand, Helen was even more devastating. She didn't attack her character. She simply presented the facts. She brought up the spreadsheet of the $85,000 in withdrawals. "Mrs. Petrenko," Helen asked, her voice dangerously soft, "can you explain to the court why you needed $800 for veterinary bills for a cat that, according to records from your landlord, you have never owned?" Emily stammered, her composure cracking. Helen moved on, presenting the bank statements, the texts, the pattern of manufactured emergencies. The image of the loving daughter began to crumble, replaced by that of a calculating grifter. The climax of the trial, however, was a surprise even to me. Helen called a private investigator to the stand. I had no idea she had hired one. The investigator testified that for the past 2 months, he had been conducting surveillance on the dream house in the gated community. And then Helen presented the evidence, photographs and sworn affidavits from neighbors. The photographs showed 2 people moving furniture into the house, hosting a barbecue, collecting the mail. It was an older couple. The investigator identified them as Mark's parents, Robert and Patricia Petrenko. Further investigation had revealed that Emily and Mark were not living in the house at all. They were renting a trendy downtown apartment, the lease for which had been signed a week before the mortgage on the house had closed. The courtroom was silent. The fraud was now undeniable and far more audacious than I had ever imagined. They hadn't stolen my identity to buy their dream house. They had stolen it to buy a lavish, mortgage-free home for his parents, while continuing their own lifestyle funded by my money. They had used me to set up the other side of their family for life. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it took my breath away. It wasn't just about greed, it was about replacement. They had literally replaced me and my side of the family with his. When Helen presented the final piece of evidence, the deed of the house, which had a clause, buried in the fine print, that transferred ownership to a trust controlled by Mark's father upon my death, the case was over. Their lawyer's face was ashen. Mark stared at the floor, his mask of confidence shattered. Emily just looked at me, her expression a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. She wasn't sorry. She was furious that her perfect plan had been exposed. The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. He found them guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. He voided the loan, making the house subject to immediate seizure and sale by the bank. But he didn't stop there. In his scathing final remarks, he spoke of the callous and predatory nature of their crimes. He ordered them not only to be held liable for all associated legal fees and bank penalties, but to pay me a significant sum in punitive damages for the emotional distress and financial peril they had caused. The amount he specified was enough to cover not only my losses, but much more. I had won. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a total vindication. Their lies had been exposed, their carefully crafted narrative destroyed. As they were led out of the courtroom, their faces a mask of defeated rage, I felt no triumph, only a vast, empty sadness for the daughter I had truly and finally lost forever. The aftermath of the trial was as swift and devastating for them as the verdict itself. The court's judgment set off a chain reaction that obliterated the life Emily and Mark had built on a foundation of lies. The house was sold at auction by the bank for less than the fraudulent mortgage, leaving them liable for the shortfall. The punitive damages awarded to me, combined with their own exorbitant legal fees, forced them into bankruptcy. Their downtown apartment, with its trendy address and luxury amenities, was a casualty of their financial ruin. They were evicted. News of the trial spread through our community like wildfire. Friends and family who had been swayed by their narrative of a confused mother were now faced with the stark, undeniable truth of the court's findings. The whispers of sympathy for them turned into murmurs of condemnation. They became social pariahs, their reputations irrevocably tarnished. I heard through Carol that Mark's freelance business had dried up completely, clients unwilling to work with a man convicted of fraud. Emily, who had never held a steady job for long, was forced to take a position at a discount retail store. They had to move into a cramped, run-down apartment in a part of town they had always looked down upon. Their brutal and complete defeat was not just financial, it was a social and personal implosion. For me, the victory was quiet but absolute. The compensation I received was substantial. After paying Helen's fees, I was left with a sum that not only restored what they had stolen, but secured my future beyond anything David or I could have imagined. For a while, I did nothing with the money. I let it sit in the bank, a silent testament to the battle I had fought and won. I needed to heal, to reclaim the peace they had stolen from me. My support group of women celebrated with a quiet dinner at my house. We didn't toast to revenge. We toasted to resilience, to justice, and to the strength of sisterhood. They had been my anchor in the storm, and my victory was theirs as well. Slowly, I began to live again. The constant knot of anxiety in my stomach finally unwound. I started sleeping through the night. One day, I was driving my old reliable sedan when I passed a Tesla dealership. On a whim, I pulled in. I had always admired their sleek design and innovative technology, but had considered them an extravagance I could never afford. An hour later, I drove off the lot in a brand new, deep blue Model S. The silent, powerful acceleration felt like freedom. It wasn't a reckless purchase. It was a declaration of independence. I was no longer living a life defined by fear, prudence, and the needs of others. I was investing in my own joy. That car was the beginning of my new life. I sold the big, empty family house with all its painful memories and bought a beautiful, modern condo with a view of the city's skyline. I started traveling, finally taking that trip to Italy in David's memory. I enrolled in a pottery class, something I had always wanted to do, and discovered a passion for shaping clay with my own hands. I was building a life that was entirely my own, on my own terms. About a year after the trial, a letter arrived at my new address. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting shaky and familiar. It was from Emily. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But curiosity, a final, lingering echo of the mother I once was, compelled me to read it. It was a long, rambling letter filled with self-pity and excuses. She wrote about their hardships, the shame, the constant struggle to make ends meet. She claimed she had finally realized the depth of her mistake. She wrote that she missed me, that she loved me, and that she was begging, truly begging, for my forgiveness. The final paragraph was a desperate plea for help. Not for a lot, she wrote, just enough to get them back on their feet. I read the letter once, my face impassive. The words that would have once shattered my heart now had no effect. They were just ink on paper, the last desperate gambit from a person who had proven she would never change. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for another handout. I walked to the sleek stainless steel paper shredder in my new home office. I fed the letter into the slot and watched as it was sliced into 1,000 tiny, meaningless pieces. I did not feel anger, or sadness, or even pity. I felt nothing at all. I was free. I turned away from the confetti of my past and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. My life was bright, and it was entirely my own. The future was waiting. 3 years had passed. 3 years since the gavel fell and shattered the false world my daughter had built. 3 years since I had last seen her face, contorted not with remorse but with the rage of being caught. Time, it turns out, is the most skillful of healers. It doesn't erase the scars, but it turns them from raw, weeping wounds into thin, silvery lines that only remind you of a battle fought, rather than forcing you to relive it every day.
My life had found a rhythm I had never known before, a rhythm of peace and purpose. I sold the Tesla. It was a beautiful car, a symbol of my initial liberation. But over time, I realized that freedom wasn't about speed and shine. Freedom was the quiet within. I invested a portion of the money into a small pottery studio I opened with 2 friends from my support group. We called it the Phoenix, a place where formless clay, put through fire, is reborn as something beautiful and strong. For us, the metaphor wasn't just a name, it was a creed. I no longer thought of Emily and Mark. Their images had faded, bleached out like an old photograph left in the sun. Fragments of news would sometimes reach me through Carol, who occasionally heard things from distant acquaintances. Theirs was a banal tragedy of people who had wagered everything on a lie. They had divorced a year after the trial. Mark, his reputation destroyed, was never able to rebuild his business and had reportedly moved to another state to start over, buried in debt.
Emily's fate was sadder. Stripped of her financial cushion and accustomed luxuries, she had never learned to live within her means. She drifted from one low-paying job to another, constantly moving. Carol mentioned seeing her downtown once. She looked exhausted, her eyes holding none of their former arrogant confidence. Listening to the account, I felt no gloating, no satisfaction, just a brief, detached sorrow, the kind you feel when reading about a stranger's misfortune. The emotional cord they had so ruthlessly exploited had been severed and was now dead and buried. The turning point for my own future came on a rainy autumn evening. We were hosting a charity event at our studio, raising funds for a local women's shelter. After it was over, a young woman approached me. She thanked me profusely for organizing the event, and then, haltingly, told me her own story. Her brother had convinced their elderly mother to sign over the deed to her house, leaving her with almost nothing. The story was painfully familiar. I couldn't sleep that night. I realized that my victory was not just my own, it was a precedent. I had the resources, an iron will, and the best lawyer I could find. But how many people like me had none of that? How many elderly people suffer in silence, defrauded by those they trust most in the world? The next morning, I called Helen Davis. We met in the same office where my battle had once begun. I laid out my idea. I didn't want my estate, upon my death, to simply become a set of numbers in an inheritance. I wanted it to work. I wanted to transform the pain of my past into hope for someone else's future. Together, we drafted the charter for a charitable foundation. We named it the David Connolly Foundation for Elder Rights. In memory of the husband who had worked his entire life to protect me, his foundation would now protect others. The mission was simple and clear: to provide pro bono legal services and psychological support for victims of familial financial abuse. My settlement, which had grown with sound investments, became its endowment. Signing the documents at the solicitor's office, I felt the last knot in my soul untie. My story was no longer about betrayal. It had become the prologue to something much larger. The money that had been the source of so much strife and suffering was now being forged into an instrument of justice. Sometimes, when I'm working in my studio, I look at my hands, covered in clay, strong and steady. I am creating something new, useful, beautiful, and I realize I have done the same with my life. I took the broken pieces left by betrayal, and through a trial by fire, I have created something whole and valuable. Not just a new life for myself, but a legacy that will live on and help others long after I am gone. And in that quiet, creative certainty, I have finally found true, unbreakable peace. The foundation, which we named the David Connolly Legacy, had become the center of my world. In the 5 years since the trial, it had grown from an idea born of pain into a tangible force for good. We had a small, dedicated staff, a board of directors comprised of compassionate and sharp-minded individuals, including Helen Davis, who had become a dear friend, and a growing list of success stories. We had helped dozens of seniors recover stolen assets, provided counseling for those shattered by betrayal, and lobbied for stronger legal protections against elder financial abuse. My life was full, the quiet hum of purpose, a constant and welcome companion to the gentle rhythm of my days at the pottery studio. The past was a closed book, gathering dust on a distant shelf, or so I thought. The call came from Helen on a Tuesday morning. I was in the studio, my hands covered in the cool slip of wet clay as I centered a new piece on the wheel. Her voice was stripped of its usual warmth, replaced by a crisp, professional tone that immediately put me on high alert. "Sarah, I need you to sit down," she said without preamble. "There's been an attack." My mind instantly flew to physical threats, to security systems and alarms. But the reality was far more insidious. Helen explained that a series of articles had appeared on a handful of notoriously salacious online blogs. They were exposés, hit pieces targeting me and the foundation. She sent me the links, and with a sense of cold dread, I wiped the clay from my hands and opened them on my tablet. The articles were a toxic slurry of half-truths and outright lies, all attributed to a close family source who wished to remain anonymous. It was Emily's voice, dripping with venom, in every line. She had painted me as a manipulative matriarch who had always been cold and controlling. The lawsuit, she claimed, was a calculated move to spitefully disinherit her after she had married a man I didn't approve of. The story of the fraudulent loan was twisted into a family misunderstanding that my unstable and vindictive nature had blown into a public spectacle. But the most vicious attacks were reserved for the foundation itself. It was described as a massive tax shelter, a vanity project I had created to launder my ill-gotten gains and feel important. The anonymous source alleged that the foundation did little real work, that it was a hollow PR stunt, and that the money I had stolen from my daughter's inheritance was being squandered. Reading the words was like having poison poured into my bloodstream. It was a vile, desperate attempt to destroy the one thing I had built from the ashes of my life. She wasn't just attacking me anymore. She was attacking my husband's memory, the good work of our staff, and the vulnerable people we were trying to help. The immediate fallout was small, but sharp. A major corporate donor we had been courting for months called to indefinitely postpone their contribution, citing the need to avoid controversy. A few nasty anonymous comments appeared on our foundation's social media page, parroting the lies from the articles. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, an attempt to bleed our reputation dry. A flicker of the old fear, the familiar panic of being blindsided and betrayed, rose in my chest. For a moment, I was back in my old living room, holding that first letter from the bank, the world crumbling around me. But only for a moment. The woman I was now was not the woman I had been then. I closed the tablet, took a long, slow breath, and felt the fear recede, replaced by a cold, familiar resolve. She had come back, a serpent slithering into my peaceful garden, hoping to find me weak. She would be disappointed. I called an emergency meeting of the Foundation's board. As they gathered around the conference table that afternoon, their faces etched with concern, I felt a surge of strength. I was not alone this time. "She is trying to pull me into a public mud wrestling match," I told them, my voice steady. "She wants me to scream and cry and deny, to give her story oxygen. She wants to make this about family drama. We will not allow that. This is not about family. This is about the integrity of our work. And we will fight this, not with emotion, but with truth." We spent the next 2 hours mapping out our strategy. It would be swift, professional, and utterly transparent. Emily had fired the first shot in a new war, aiming for my heart, but she had miscalculated. She wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting my legacy, and it was far stronger than she could ever imagine. Our counteroffensive was launched less than 24 hours after the board meeting. It was not the loud, angry rebuttal Emily likely hoped for. It was a quiet, devastatingly effective campaign of radical transparency. We did not engage with the gossip blogs. We did not mention my daughter's name. We simply and powerfully presented the truth. Our first move was to release an official statement from the board of directors. It was posted on our website and sent to our entire mailing list of donors and supporters. The statement acknowledged that a malicious and baseless smear campaign had been initiated against our founder and our work. It stated that while our policy was not to engage with slander, our commitment to transparency was absolute. Attached to the statement were 2 documents. The first was a concise, professionally written summary of the public court records from 5 years ago. It laid out the undisputed facts, the identity theft, the bank fraud, the final judgment in my favor. It was not an emotional plea. It was a cold, hard recitation of legal fact that utterly dismantled the narrative of a family misunderstanding. The second document was our foundation's complete audited financial report from the previous fiscal year. It detailed every dollar received and every dollar spent, on legal aid for clients, on operational costs, on community outreach. It showed, with unimpeachable clarity, that we were not a tax shelter or a vanity project, but a lean and effective charitable organization. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails and messages of support flooded our inbox. Donors, far from being spooked, were impressed by our forthrightness. The corporate sponsor who had gotten cold feet called back personally to apologize and confirmed their contribution, even increasing the amount as a show of faith. The final and most crucial part of our strategy was to control our own narrative. I agreed to a single interview, not with a journalist looking for a scandal, but with a respected host of a local public affairs program known for her thoughtful, in-depth interviews. I sat across from her in the television studio, the bright lights warm on my face. I did not speak of Emily. I did not speak of my personal pain. When she asked about the online attacks, I simply said, "Our foundation exists to help those who have been harmed by the exact kind of deception and manipulation you see in those articles." In a way, this smear campaign has become an unfortunate but powerful example of why our work is so necessary. I spent the rest of the interview talking about the foundation. I told the stories, with their permission and all names changed, of the people we had helped. An 80-year-old man whose grandson had stolen his life savings. A 75-year-old woman whose daughter had secretly taken out a reverse mortgage on her home. I spoke of their courage, of their resilience, and of the profound need for a system to protect the most vulnerable among us. I was not a victim, I was an advocate. The interview was a quiet triumph. By refusing to be dragged into the mud, by focusing entirely on the mission, I had rendered Emily's attack impotent. The slanderous articles, deprived of the fuel of a public feud, withered and died, buried under an avalanche of public support for our work. The serpent had been driven from the garden. A week later, I was back in my studio, a sense of profound peace settling over me. Helen called. "I thought you'd like to know," she said, a smile in her voice, "that since the interview aired, online donations to the foundation have tripled. It seems your daughter's attempt to destroy your reputation has turned into our most successful fundraising campaign yet." I laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that came from my very soul. I looked down at the vase I was shaping on the wheel. It was tall, elegant, and strong. I thought about the fire it would have to endure in the kiln to become permanent, to find its final, unbreakable form. Emily's last, desperate act of malice had failed. She had tried to poison my present, but had only succeeded in fortifying my future. She had tried to tear down my legacy, but had instead cemented it in the public eye, making it stronger, brighter, and more resilient than ever before. The book on my past was not just closed, it was now sealed shut, its story complete. My hands steadied the spinning clay, and I continued to create.